I believe that before presenting her, I have to highlight the importance of this activity in the way we try to highlight it in the consulate. The important, and we make it in the framework of the celebration of the bicentennial of Venezuelan independence. And I believe that that's very important because right now in Venezuela, when we talk about independence, we are talking about emancipation, and we are talking about anti-imperialism values that were part of our independence struggle, which I believe are very valid at this time of the history. So, because of that, we organized this event, also celebrating the bicentennial of the Venezuelan independence. And I also believe that it's important to recognize that this event is very important in terms of the current events that have been happening recently in the world. Just to mention a couple of them, the release of Posada Carriles, which is a very well-known terrorist that was just released a few weeks ago in a Texas judge, and also the killing of another terrorist, Osama bin Laden. So I believe that those are importances that we have to take into consideration before listening to Eva. And I want to mention just a brief bio from Eva. She is editor from the English version of Correo del Orinoco. She won the International Award for Journalism in Mexico in 2009. She's an attorney and a writer from New York that has been living in Caracazo in 2005, and she has been author of very best-selling books like The Chavez Code, Bush versus Chavez, Washington's Wars on Venezuela, and The Empire's Web, Encyclopedia of Interventionism and Subversion. She is a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College and CUNY Law School in New York, and has been investigating and analyzing and writing about U.S. intervention in Venezuela using the Freedom of Information Act. So I believe that we have to receive Eva Golinger right
now. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. I was here, I guess, what, 5 years ago? 2006 in DePaul and in Chicago, and I was here also in 2005, so I'm happy to come back, although I have to say, and I'm not going to spend minutes really wasting time talking about Osama bin Laden, but I do have to say that listening to Stephanie, and we had a conversation before this event, and coming into this country at this moment is a pretty frightening experience. And turning on the television and watching not just the rejoicing and the celebrating of death and war, but also the just extreme sort of applauding of U.S. military power and forces, you know, just the whole scenarios that are being played over and over again on all the different channels in the country right now to distract from other things taking place, but also to try in some way to rejuvenate that feeling of patriotism and things, different tactics that the U.S. government employs when it needs its people to forget about everything else going on in the world and in their own lives, in their own country, you know, the economy and the pits and unemployment skyrocketing and people still losing their homes and benefits being cut and salaries being cut and public spending being frozen, to forget about all of that and just celebrate, you know, some alleged victory of U.S. military power. I mean, it's a pretty scary experience, especially when in my case, I don't live in the U.S. anymore, and I spend time in a country where life is being celebrated and where efforts are being made every minute of every day to improve the lives of the people of Venezuela, the country that I live in. And so anyway, it's a very strange experience, and it's frightening. And then to hear about, you know, the increase in harassment and persecution of activists in the United States, and how that does directly relate to us. And I mean, it gave me chills listening to Stephanie and thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe they are going to come for me after all. You know, if you do work, if you do solidarity work in a country that comes under the target, which can happen at any time, because we can remember, you know, Osama bin Laden as one character who at once was in the employ of the CIA. I mean, that's not any kind of fiction or fantasy or conspiracy theory. It's reality. U.S. government documents show that they saw Venezuela as the key to controlling Latin America. So the vision into the early 1990s, when lots of things took place, this Caracazo, which I mentioned, which the result of that popular uprising was the government at the time sending out the armed forces and the police to massacre the people. And more than 3,000 people were killed on that day, and the majority of them, 99.9%, were poor people that were just out there protesting because they were starving and living in miserable conditions. And the government at the time said, just kill them. Eliminate them. Eliminate this. And it was a government that then was protected and supported by the United States and seen as, you know, if we don't keep this one in power, it'll have consequences for the rest of Latin America. If we can't control Venezuela, how come we can control the rest of electoral processes, which many people who live in the U.S. don't know how much of your money is going to fund political parties and groups and campaigns in other countries. And in this case, yeah, the U.S. was working very closely with the candidates that they believed were the most allied to their interests and the most subordinate to their interests. And as the dates got closer to the campaign, there's one document that's really interesting because it was August 1998, 2 weeks after the campaign had started, and most of it's a secret document from the State Department that's been partially declassified. Of course, they leave out the best parts, but some that they did leave in were really interesting because they say, well, now Hugo Chavez is the leading candidate, but it doesn't, but something in the, I don't have it here, but something along the lines of, we don't have to worry that much about it because someone will take care of him before he could win. You know, saying, we have to take it out. I mean, the same type of mentality that unfortunately still reigns in U.S. foreign policy today. You know, we would prefer to take him out, assassinate him, rather than go through any kind of legitimate process or respect the will of the people, right? In any event, he won. And there was a lot, Chavez tells some of the stories today of how they tried to buy him over and, you know, get Chavez, get him on their side, even though initially they denied him a visa to the U.S., then they gave him a visa, you know, tried to, whatever, do the usual stuff that the U.S. government does and that its allies do to try to get important people on their side and under their, you know, agenda. And none of it worked. And so what began to happen was, you know, there was some concern. The initial U.S. policy towards Venezuela was a wait and see. Let's just wait and see what happened. It was unimaginable at that time period that Venezuela would be what it is today and that this situation would be what it is today. Unimaginable for U.S. foreign policy. I mean, completely. And I know this because I'm basing it on their own documents and reports. Absolutely unimaginable. If they weren't able to buy him, you know, get him on their side, then they'd take him out somehow. And so what began to happen was as the Bolivarian Revolution began to flourish and changes began to take place and a new constitution was created by the people of Venezuela, and for the first time ever in the history of the country, all those people marginalized and excluded were involved in their political process, were invited, were, you know, urged, were encouraged to be a part of it, and all of a sudden became visible after living their lives as invisible people, outcast in their own country. You know, and so major changes began to take place in the few beginning years of the revolution in Venezuela. I mean, 99, 2000, 2001, but nothing on the scale of what's happening today. Coup takes place, it's defeated by the people in one of the most extraordinary popular uprisings in history, I would say world history. Again, a very spontaneous uprising, but the fact that, you know, the majority of the people, poor, humble, unarmed, could come out into the streets within a 48-hour period and defeat a coup d'etat backed by the most powerful country in the world. I mean, it's something unfathomable to many, but that changed Venezuela forever. And many people also at that time, because those were the beginning years of the transformations taking place, many people at that time saw it, you know, who maybe were skeptical of what was happening, became very clear. You know, we know what we're up against, we know what we're doing. We know what we have, we know what we're building. You know, we're not going to go back to how it was before, forget it. Because even during the brief time that the coup was successful, which was a window of no more than 2 days, massive repression in the streets, suspension of not just constitutional rights, the dictatorship that took over at the time dissolved every institution in the country. It was absolutely incredible. That's one of the best things about the opposition in Venezuela is that they self-destruct. It's incredible. No, they do the most ridiculous things that end up harming themselves. I mean, that was something that was perceived by a lot of the majority of people in the country as completely unacceptable. Anyway, after all that situation, there were other efforts throughout those beginning years to continue to try to undermine and overthrow the Chavez administration. A very severe strike in the oil industry at the end of 2002 into 2003, a media war of unbelievable proportions that continues to this day, but that has been controlled a little bit more, been combated in a way that's been more successful, and ongoing efforts to just create a climate of destabilization in the country. After 2005, well, in 2004 we had a recall referendum against Chavez's mandate, something that's included in the new constitution that was drafted and ratified by the people of Venezuela. And he won overwhelmingly. It was a 60-40 victory, which was more than he had gotten in elections prior, and more people had voted than had ever voted in elections before. In 2005, it's the first time that the U.S. places Venezuela on one of its famous lists. The U.S. government creates all these unilateral lists where they say you're a terrorist, or you're a drug trafficker, or you're trafficking in people, or you violate human rights, or this, that, and the other. And it's done under no international criteria. It's not something that is decided in any kind of environment where other nations are involved. It's something done by the U.S. government and its different agencies. They place Venezuela on the list of countries not collaborating enough with the war on drugs, drug trafficking. Why do they do this at that moment? Because in 2005, the Venezuelan government had compiled substantial evidence demonstrating that the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, was actually engaging in not just espionage, but also acts of sabotage against the efforts to counter drug trafficking. And so Chavez suspends the cooperation with DEA. The reaction was immediate. So then, if you suspend cooperation with U.S. DEA, then you're a drug dealer. The Bush administration formally requested that Venezuela be placed on the list of state sponsors of terror. And there were hearings held about it in Congress, and the decision was made not to do it because there's a big problem, which means, if a country's on the list of state sponsors of terror, all relations are cut off. Venezuela is one of the biggest suppliers of oil to the United States, so they couldn't figure out a way around that. But in a political sense, and in terms of security and defense policy, they decided to, yes, consider Venezuela as an enemy, consider the Chavez government as an enemy. And in 2010, which was last year, yes, which now, it doesn't really matter if it was Bush or Obama. When it comes to U.S. foreign policy, as you're now seeing everywhere these days in terms of expansion of wars, use of assassination as a political tool, indiscriminately, with no respect for sovereignty of nations and borders, things like that, that exist in international law, people's self-determination, human rights. In 2010, Obama's Director of National Intelligence, in his annual threat assessment report, as they call them, classified Venezuela and President Chavez as the leading threat to U.S. interests, not just in the region, but one of the leading threats in the world, and classified Chavez himself as the #1 anti-U.S. leader in the region. Just the year before, in 2009, a military agreement, which was executed by Obama, between the U.S. and Colombia was implemented that would allow the U.S. to increase substantially its military presence in the region, occupying or using 7 military bases in Colombia, but also having full access territorially to Colombia. And some documents from the U.S. Air Force from May of 2009 that were justifying, because they requested $46 million, again from taxpayer money, to improve the installations in one of those bases in Palenquero, Colombia. And in the justification for that money, in a official U.S. Air Force document, military document, they said, in a lengthy paragraph, but the most important line to me, was not only that they would be engaging from that base in full spectrum operations throughout the continent, which means, that's not just
combating drug trafficking in the region, full spectrum operations throughout South America, but also that they would be combating the anti-U.S. government to create jobs, and not to be something that's just, oh, the state's going to do this. No, involving communities, workers, training workers, and to help them build cooperatives, create cooperative companies that then can be contracted by the state. I mean, ways, inventive, creative ways to create jobs, to stimulate national development, you know, to ensure that people have access to not just benefits, but also to having the possibility of a dignified lifestyle. And this is taking place in a country that is being, you know, demified or vilified is the word. Sorry, sometimes I have translation problems in my own head, living in two languages. Being vilified constantly as some kind of dictatorship or terrible democracy or terrible whatever they want to call it. You know, some of the phrases used are authoritarian democracy, which is strange. Semi-dictatorship is another one. You know, Chavez is a tyrant, obviously. One of the things they always say. I love those types of things, like the dictatorship or the tyrant, when you hear it on Fox News, or, you know, Chavez is some kind of brutal dictator, and then there he is in some event in a community where people, you know, involved directly with the people of the community, giving them the chance and the opportunity to express themselves, and inviting them to be involved in whatever, managing their own resources in that community to build homes or to pave the roads or whatever, you know, and listening to all the different diverse voices. And in a country that has still, because one of the main criticisms that comes out of international media is that freedom of expression is under threat in Venezuela. Well, I would invite anybody to look at any media outlet from Venezuela to see that it's certainly thriving. It's definitely not under any kind of threat whatsoever. I mean, not only do people openly call for actions, violent actions, criminal actions against the government and the president himself, including assassination, which personally I don't think that that's something that should be sanctioned under or allowed under freedom of expression. But still, it happens there. But also, still, more than 70% of television stations are in the hands of private enterprises. More than 90% of newspapers are, and the same goes for radio. And most of those are critical of the government, if not like anti. So yes, there's a state apparatus now, public media, you know, more alternative media, community media, which didn't exist before. Some of the state media did. Community media, alternative media in Venezuela did not exist before in a legitimate legal way. In fact, a lot of it was considered, you know, underground or was threatened under constant harassment from the governments prior to President Chavez. And I'm not going to praise every aspect of the government because nothing is perfect whatsoever. And of course, this is one of the aspects that I most love about what's happening in Venezuela is that it's a human process, full of errors, just like we all have our errors and failures and successes. And that it's a process that's constantly reviewing, you know, what's going on, that it's not a process that's taking place in any kind of rapid way. A lot of times people, you know, including those of us that form a part of it, question things either that Chavez does or that happen, or why, for example, did President Chavez pardon and give amnesty to everybody involved in the coup in 2007? I would like to see them all brought to justice. You know, by doing that, he opened the door to now having more than 40% of the parliament, of the National Assembly, in the hands of the opposition, many of them who were involved in the coup. Many of them who were there applauding the dissolving of that same parliament on April 12, 2002, have now been elected. Many of them who've been receiving funding from the U.S. government for years, something that's prohibited in the United States. A political party, a candidate, can't receive funding from a foreign government. You know, it's illegal. Now it's illegal in Venezuela, thanks to the work that we've been doing for years. But still, it's not being, the laws aren't being implemented exactly. But, I mean, there are things that happen that one questions and that one criticizes in the country. There's still a very severe problem with corruption, but there's a battle against it. It's not that the government is doing anything. Last year alone, more than 3,000 cases of corruption were prosecuted by the Attorney General's office, the equivalent. Intervene to help the banks, right? And the financial institutions. And the people that lost their homes or lost their savings, what'd they get? Nothing. What did the Venezuelan government do? It intervened to help the people, protect all the customer savings. No one lost their savings. And in the case that the bank was so corrupted from within, they nationalized it. So there were like 11 banks last year that were intervened and either liquidated or nationalized. And where did the bank owners go and those that were running it? Most of them went to Miami. Yeah, that's where they are right now. They went to Miami with the stolen money. They took the money. Whatever was left of it, they took it. The people's money. So what did the state do? The state took public funds, state funds, to guarantee customer savings so that nobody would lose anything. We had a similar thing, just to give a couple comparisons, things that you probably never hear about unless you read the newspaper that I run in English, the Correo Orinoco International. Another issue, housing. In the U.S., well, what happened? People that had taken out loans and all this kind of stuff, and there was fraud involved in whatever, they lost their homes, right? Foreclosure, lost it. Living in cars, living in tents, living in the streets, piling up families and friends in homes, you know, overcrowded. What they do in Venezuela? Well, we have a series of different kinds of housing crises. Some are due to, you know, the situation of people that have been living in very unstable conditions on mountainsides, and there have been a lot of problems recently with heavy rains that have caused flooding, and, you know, have left over 130,000 people homeless. But there's also another situation, and those are people the government is attending to as a sort of priority. There's another situation that's that's just wilder, which is people, mainly middle class, who bought into apartments that were like a building, you know, hey, we're going to build this building, look at it, it's beautiful, and all the pictures, you have to buy into it, right, before it's built. I mean, that happens here in the U.S. as well. So people buy into it, they put a down payment on an apartment. And what was happening was, they put the down payment on the apartments aren't getting built. And so what are the construction owners or the owners of the property are saying to these people, well, because of inflation, we have to raise the price, so now you have to start paying a monthly fee in order to guarantee that we can keep building this property. So this was a situation going on, massive real estate fraud. I mean, thousands of people affected. Luckily, a government that listens, primarily a president that listens to its people, heard the story that some people were probably telling on TV one day about this situation and said, wait a minute, we've got to do something. This is crazy. These people are all being subjected to this terrible scam, being defrauded and losing their money, and their homes aren't even being built. So the government intervened, nationalized some of those companies, just took over the process and is now building those homes. And is making sure that they get the original price. I mean, do you guys get what I'm saying? Like in terms of upside downside world, country that's criticized as being non-democratic, violating its people's rights, and, you know, dictatorship. I mean, it's not what's happening. There could be you can criticize whatever you want, but that's definitely not the situation in Venezuela. It's the opposite. By again reiterating the necessity of people in the U.S. to know, one, where your money's going. I think that most people would agree that you don't want it going to something, one, that's not going to benefit your own country, community, development, prosperity, but two, to undermine the democracy in another country, to undermine the people's will, to create a climate of constant conflict and destabilization. You know, and it's something, as I said, the Obama administration is actually increasing. The other is outrageous that they would consider, I said 2008, that they first talked about placing Venezuela on the list of state sponsors of terror. It was repeated in 2009, they didn't do it, 2010, and this year has been reiterated and the list hasn't come out yet. It still is doubtful that it could happen because of the oil factor, but it's possible. There are now, with the changes in the U.S. Congress, people in charge of foreign relations who are adamantly calling for actions to be taken directly against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. The president now, or the whatever, head of the House Committee on Foreign Relations, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. Yeah, there's a far right-wing Cuban-American Republican from Florida who's leading that committee. Has actually openly called for the assassination of Chavez. And the head of the subcommittee on foreign relations for the Western Hemisphere of the House is Connie Mack, who's another Florida Republican who's totally crazed. I mean, and he's fanatically obsessed with Chavez. And he said that his objective and goal as head of the subcommittee would be to get Hugo Chavez. So even though it sounds ridiculous, there was a conference held last year in the U.S. Capitol. on November 17, 2010, called Danger in the Andes. And it was hosted by these congresspeople and others, and to which they invited a whole plethora of ex-coup leaders and some of these corrupt guys in Miami and all kinds of stuff to speak there at this event, where they talked about primarily Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, about the growing threat to U.S. and inter-American security. And it came just as NATO had met, and as a result of the meeting of NATO, there was a declaration made where they said, I can't remember this all exactly, that if NATO perceived that their countries' interests were being threatened anywhere around the world, their security was being threatened anywhere around the world, that they could intervene, that they could activate their and use their military power, as we're seeing Libya, right? Well, the same type of language was used at this event, talking about inter-American security, and that this is a threat. Venezuela is a threat. Bolivia is a threat. Ecuador is a threat. Personally, I saw that whole event as an incredible threat to Latin America, but dangerous because it was being something that was seen or given legitimacy by being held in the U.S. Capitol, and then sort of formalizing this policy of now officially declaring Venezuela, primarily Venezuela, as a threat. Your money is being used and is being approved through Congress to continue to fund a conflict and feed a conflict in Venezuela, and illegal now violate the law because, and I'm proud to say, I mean, it's work I've been doing for years and trying to get legislation passed in Venezuela that prohibits foreign funding of political groups. And just in December, that law was finally passed. So now we have the legislation in Venezuela to prevent, to at least prevent that funding technically from happening. There was a meeting held a few weeks ago, January, by some leaders of Venezuelan political groups in Washington with representatives of Congress and others from the State Department, where they were talking about the law and how concerned they were about the law. Now, what are they going to do? How are we going to get the money? Because not only is there that law, now we have the law, there's also, we have currency controls in Venezuela to prevent capital flight. I mean, the dollar is not Venezuela's currency, and there's a lot of dollars coming in from the oil industry. So there are currency controls so that, those who have a lot of that currency can't just take all the dollars out and crash the economy. So the other issue is, how are they getting the money into the country? And one of the things that we know is that it's coming in through a series of different ways. One is through diplomatic valets from the embassy, which is just gross. They're just bringing in like suitcases of cash and handing it out, which is not anything new for U.S. policy. The other is they're doing it through the figure or the use of awards. Like, oh, we'll award this guy $500,000 for whatever, economic achievement, whatever. Like they did with this kid who is barely 21 years old, just graduating from law school in Venezuela, who was leading an opposition student movement in 2007. And after some of their protests, whatever, they had some relative successes in terms of making it onto the international scene. The Cato Institute, which is a right-wing think tank, but still closely linked to the U.S. government, awarded him $500,000, the Milton Friedman Award for, yeah, I'm serious, the Milton Friedman Award for Milton Friedman Award for economic freedom. This kid, who hadn't even done anything, certainly wasn't an economist. So it's a way, what did he do with that money? He set up an institute that now works to train youth and young people in different tactics and strategies of trying to promote regime change. But the point is that, so in the meeting they were talking about how can we get the funding into Venezuela, so how to send it through third-party countries, through different embassies, using the facade of prizes, or funding to universities, things like that. So they're actively trying to conceive of ways to violate Venezuela's laws. So one is, it's your money, it's taxpayer dollars. You can talk to your Congress people, write letters, do campaigns, any way possible. It's budgets that are being approved. The budget for 2012 hasn't been approved yet. Take that $5 million out of it. It's crazy. What is Obama doing putting that in there in the first place?
I'm Venezuelan, so thank you for your talk and for for giving this perspective, because there's rarely a U.S. government. So thank you. I have a few questions about basically oil dependency, and I have noticed that oil has been going down in Venezuela, and at the same time, the elections in last election, September 26th, the parliamentary elections, you mentioned that a little bit, around 40% of the new Congress is integrated by opposition leaders, opposition politicians. So I was wondering, why do you think? Because in the end, people voted in that election, and there was actually a law, an electoral law promulgated in 2009 or 2010 that basically changed a lot of the rules of the game about elections. So what? I see there's a triangle between like oil prices going down, and the economic situation becoming very hard, and then the electoral law, and then the result that it wasn't adverse for the Chavez government, but it wasn't as positive as some people could have predicted. So what do you think about that, and why is the popularity supposed to be going down?
Yeah, I mean, it depends actually how you look at it, because in the last legislative elections before 2010, which were 2005, the opposition boycotted, so they lost all their seats, but by their own volition. And then in the elections before that, which were 2000, they won 80-some seats, so they had almost equal amount of seats as the pro-Chavez was. Of course, it was the beginning of the revolution, so things have changed. My opinion is that, Venezuelans are not blind-eyed stupid. They're voting for people. They're not always just voting for Chavez when Chavez isn't running. So they're voting according to, wait a minute, who's this person versus who's this person? And the problems of corruption or inefficiencies or things that haven't gotten accomplished. The voters punish with votes when they vote. In the U.S. they punish by, I guess, not voting at all. But at least in Venezuela they're voting, which is the most important part of electoral democracy, at least. So I think that some of it had to do with, in certain areas, people who were voting per the person and not party lines. And the other is the fact that more opposition people participated than ever before. So, and in the end, the Chavez's party, the PSUV party, which is a new party, which just started 3 years ago, 2 years ago, isn't even fully consolidated, won more seats than any political party in Venezuela has ever won in history. So that's actually a humongous achievement. And so the fact that they have, 98 seats, one party. Versus the opposition has 20 different, maybe it's not 20, maybe it's 13 different parties. They had more than 20 parties ran. And their bloc of 40% is not a unified bloc. They call themselves the MUD. That's their acronym. I think it's really funny. But it's the Mesa de Unidad Democrática, the Table of Democratic Unity, but the initials are MUD, so MUD. The MUD is comprised of all these different political parties, and they don't agree with each other. So, in the end, it's a very diverse Congress, which is good. I think it's good. I don't like the fact that there are people in there who, to me, are criminals who have, been involved in coups and violated numerous Venezuelan laws, but, what are you going to do? And so, I think it's reflective of a variety of different factors. People's discontent with different politicians that they didn't want to re-elect again, or, voting. In some cases, there was vote buying, and that stuff happens still. It happens everywhere. And in terms of the oil, last year was an incredibly difficult year, not just because oil prices went down, which now they've gone back up, so because of the situation in Libya. But last year in Venezuela, we had, the banking crisis, which I mentioned. So even though customers' savings were guaranteed, it was a terrible situation. People were in fear, they were in panic about what could happen. Then we had a drought, a severe, severe drought that ironically caused major problems in terms of energy. In the country with the world's largest oil reserves is also dependent over 75% on hydroelectric energy. So what happened was the dams, the reserves of water,
decreased to the point where there was almost an absolute collapse. And so what the government did to prevent the energy collapse, because we're talking about electricity, but it's not just electricity, because, for example, in Caracazo, where I live, the water systems are generated by electricity. So if your electricity goes out, your water goes out. So you're without energy and you're without water. So it's pretty severe. So what the government did was implement rationing. And it was harsh. We all lived through it. And so that had a huge impact as well. You know, in terms of people overall being unhappy and feeling, and then of course there were media campaigns saying it's Chavez's fault, Chavez is controlling the weather, and it's not raining because of Chavez. No, I mean, people actually said that, you know, whatever, it's the devil or God is punishing us, and so it's not raining. But I mean, there were difficult times. Economic crisis affecting Venezuela as it was affecting the world, the electricity crisis, water, I mean, all that kind of stuff. I think it's amazing that the Chavez's party won 60% of the National Assembly, considering all those factors taking place. And I think now as things are improving, now we're having the opposite. We're having heavy rains again. So it's causing these massive floods and people losing their, I mean, yeah, it's like an ongoing, you know, climate changes, whatever, happening everywhere, and all these problems to deal with. And I mean, in the end, what's most important to me is that people reflect on the changes that have taken place. You know, yes, there are problems. Who could deny that? There are always going to be problems. I mean, that's part of our evolution as humans, and especially in a government that's comprised of people, you know, making errors. Some of them don't know what they're doing, you know, some of them do. I mean, there are all kinds of difficulties. What's amazing are the transformations that have taken place today. And the fact that, you know, things are improving. It's slow. I think it's better that it be slow and that it be patient instead of it being something that's forced on people. And that's something that Chavez himself says. You know, it's an inclusionary process. We're not saying to anybody, get out. If you don't like it, get out. We're saying, no, stay. Stay. Criticize, participate, but do it constructively. Don't try to overthrow or undermine or sabotage. You know, which is what a lot in the opposition have done and continue to do over the years. Instead of trying to help the crisis that we had with energy last year, they tried to sabotage it by, one, you know, putting out all this false information saying it was the government's fault, or saying we're going to have an absolute collapse and putting people into a panic, and then at the same time trying to spike prices and inflation, saying, well, we have energy crisis and there's a water crisis, so we got to raise prices of stuff. I mean, it doesn't really make sense. But they do that. Or hoard products. You know, send people into a panic so that the supermarket shelves go bare of toilet paper or coffee or whatever, because people are hoarding, or, you know, things like that, instead of contributing to trying to resolve the situation. So, I mean, I think it's good that we have a plural National Assembly, or diverse National Assembly. And I think that things are getting better, and then it'll be reflected in 2012 in the presidential elections when Chavez wins.
Yeah, you, in the title of the talk, you had a Wikileaks.
Oh yeah, I didn't even talk about
which you didn't. No, it's fine.
Well, it's all the same.
I just wanted to, but I wanted to ask, just, I mean, how much about Venezuela has been released by Wikileaks? Has there been anything significant, you know, or what do you think are the most significant things that's come?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Wikileaks. I forgot. I mean, I talked about documents, but mainly the ones that I've gotten under FOIA. Yeah, there are over 4,000 documents of the 250,000 that make reference to Venezuela, but not even 2% have been released. And there's an issue because, for some reason, and I don't, you know, whatever, I've had dealings with Julian Assange before, several years ago, when he tried to sell me a batch of documents about Venezuela from some public official, and he wanted $3 million for it. Of course, I don't have that kind of money. So then there's some issue where I think that they've been also somehow influenced by the media campaign against Chavez in Venezuela, so they're not friendly. And I tried in the name of the newspaper and a bunch of other stuff and other people to get those documents relevant to Venezuela released to us so that we could use them. I mean, that's what I do. I deal in documents, you know. I mean, it would be for public information. They won't release them to any, they made a statement saying they won't release any of the documents on Venezuela to any media outlets or anyone in Venezuela. They gave them all to a Colombian publication. And to, of course, El País of Spain, which is rather most important to me. I wrote about it. It's a 2007 document that was written up by the ambassador, I guess it was ambassador at the time, or one of the high-level diplomats in the U.S. Embassy in Chile, in Santiago. And the document is called Containment Plan for Hugo Chavez. And it was, and actually that guy, who is Craig, what's his name, is now a high-level official in the State Department.
Kelly.
He's a Craig Kelly.
Craig Kelly.
Is it Craig Kelly? Yeah.
Could be. He's been high up in the Honduras negotiations.
Yeah, it's Craig Kelly. Yeah, it's Craig Kelly. He was the one that wrote this document. And so it was, they literally outlined like every effort that they're going to undertake in Latin America to contain the influence of Chavez in the region, to try to convince other governments to take action against Venezuela. You know, I mean, it's basically an outline of all these U.S. efforts that some of us have been denouncing for years, but in their own words. And going beyond just Latin America into European countries, trying to get France and other, you know, U.S. allies who are also have close ties with Venezuela to take a more hostile stance towards Venezuela. And yeah, I'm talking overall about Chavez as an enemy, but also revealing in the sense that they always also refer in their secretive documents that they don't want to be released to how popular and how effective Chavez has been as a leader in the region. And so what it did, and there have been a series of other documents that have come out of Brazil, the U.S. Embassy in Brazil, and of course in Colombia, that reiterate the same thing. One, the ongoing effort to try to create this international plan against Chavez, and two, to try to convince allied nations. Brazil under Lula wouldn't do it, and they talk about that in the documents. Lula won't do it, but we can get, you know, some of the other people in his government who agree with us on Chavez and things like that. And then there are documents. Some of the also more intriguing ones are the Colombian, where they go through all this stuff about the military bases, and, you know, talking about how, yeah, it's to use as a platform against Venezuela, where in some of the documents where the U.S. like encourages Uribe to try to make more links publicly between Chavez and the FARC, to make the terrorist connection, where Uribe himself, in one of the documents in a conversation with the U.S. ambassador at the time, says that he's authorized military action into Venezuela of his own armed forces, where they talk about collaborating on espionage and, you know, intelligence operations against Venezuela and the Chavez government. There have been a lot of stuff that's come out, and then there are some other ones that I like personally, which have come out of the U.S. Embassy in Caracas. One is a 2005 document where still a very powerful political figure, religious figure, whatever, bishop, or whatever they, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't need to say it in that way, a bishop, but who was involved in the coup. The Catholic Church is heavily involved in Venezuela, hierarchy in the opposition. And this particular document was a meeting between the U.S. ambassador at the time, who subsequently was the U.S. ambassador in Colombia during Uribe's administration, had a meeting with this bishop, Baltasar Porras, where the bishop was begging, basically, the U.S. government to take action, direct action against Chavez. So there we have, you know, and saying that you can use the Catholic Church to do whatever you want. You know, you can use our different churches around the country to promote your messages, propaganda, whatever, funding, and take more action against. Please do something about Chavez. Please help us, you know, get Chavez out. And there's another document that's also fascinating from 2010, just last year, where the head of a newspaper, one of the major national dailies, El Nacional, told the asked the U.S. Embassy to please fund their newspaper or they would go under. And so if by April 2010 the U.S. government didn't help get them funding, they wouldn't exist anymore. They still exist today. So I love that document because it proves that the U.S. government is funding that newspaper in Venezuela. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff. And every day I'm looking at everything to see what else is coming out. I love the documents that aren't censored. It's great.
Thank you.
I don't even know what to call it anymore. Oh, someone over here. This guy back there.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your talk and for all the work you do as well. And it's a very self-serving question because I think the most important takeaway thing is what we can do to help Venezuela tonight, and that's mostly hands-off, I know. But the self-serving question is, what do you think we can learn concretely from the Venezuelan experience that we might be able to export here?
Yeah.
Is there any possibility of a Bolivarian revolution for us?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put it in those terms, in terms of exporting. We're not trying to export anything or impose anything from Venezuela, but certainly the experiences, yeah. I mean, one is the fact that people, when they express their will, can, you know, overthrow or change, or not overthrow, change a system that's where the power is concentrated in the hands of just a few, and can turn it into something where power becomes something that belongs to everybody, breaking free of a two-party system. I think people live in fear of that in the United States in many ways, or, you know, believe that it's not possible, and so they don't try. I mean, one of the you know, an important aspect of what's happened in Venezuela has been the leadership of Hugo Chavez. That has been fundamental. The Bolivarian Revolution didn't happen because of Chavez, but he was the one who was able to unite different sectors. And that's one of the other lessons, and even though the Venezuelans haven't perfected it, is unity. I mean, you can't do anything, you can't achieve anything, especially you can't go up against a powerful adversary, be it, you know, the structures of power that have been embedded for decades or centuries in this case, if you're not united. You know, if you're allowing yourself to be divided by different, you know, petty conflicts. I mean, I know what it's like in the U.S. in terms of the left or the left progressive movements, the struggles, the conflicts, the fighting, the bickering amongst organizations, and you're never going to be able to get together to do anything. You know, you have to build coalitions. You have to unify. And I mean, yeah, I mean, it's true. Amongst different stuff. And then when you look at, in the end, those groups that support Chavez, you're looking at a whole diverse array of organizations that, you know, range from women's rights groups, community activists, you know, Afro-Venezuelan organizations, gay rights activists, different political parties that have now almost merged into the one, because that was the initiative and the sort of objective, one of the key ways of seeing, well, how we need to unite ourselves better behind one party instead of having all these different parties, because our adversary continues to be very powerful. But, you know, I mean, workers, unions, different unions, not just one union. I mean, private businesses, you know, as well, that do support Chavez, many of them. So, yeah, united behind a common goal and trying to put behind you, or at least temporarily, those differences that exist. I mean, when you're talking about that level of change, structural, absolute structural transformation, you have to have mass unity. There's no way that you can't. And beyond that, I mean, some of the fascinating lessons of building these types of community entities and cooperatives. I mean, of course, on a people level in the U.S., I mean, you can't do a lot of the stuff that in Venezuela we're doing because it's the state, you know, as well, the government supporting it. But on a community level, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, the U.S. and people in the U.S. have already accomplished on a community level in terms of community organizing, activism, different community-based organizations that do things in their communities. But what's growing in Venezuela is now the concept of building up, I mean, it actually is really fascinating, building up community councils in, you know, like in my neighborhood or whatever, that then connect with others to build larger organizations that we're calling the communes or comunas. And that they themselves will then connect with others in the region, and these will eventually, I mean, the overall sort of vision on the long term is that when we talk about people's power, transferring power to the people is eventually breaking down those structures, deconstructing the bureaucratic apparatus, and eventually having people managing on a community level all their resources and everything, to the point where hopefully someday all that bureaucracy in those institutions that are generally corrupted or work as, you know, they're the middlemen to what needs to be happening, so that people in the end, whether or not that can happen, we don't know. This is a large experiment as well. But there are experiences that can be learned from And I think one of the other things that needs to be done more, and it's difficult because Venezuela is a country that traditionally hasn't had a tourism industry, despite the fact that it has incredible, beautiful natural things to see. The largest waterfalls in the world. We've got Amazon, we've got Andean mountains, ice-capped mountains. You can go trekking, you can go whitewater rafting in the plains, and we've got the tabletop mountains that are absolutely incredible. Well, they were used for that film Up, some animated film based on that area of Venezuela. We've got Caribbean coast beaches, all kinds of stuff, diverse to see, but the country never developed a tourism industry because of the oil. And now they're starting to, but that's not the point. Go as a tourist. But I mean to say, it can be difficult at times. We've tried to do, some of you have come in delegations, maybe to Venezuela, and it hasn't always necessarily been the most friendly to delegation because the people are friendly. But in terms of facilitating that, because it's not something that has traditionally happened. But I think something that's very important are those people-to-people exchanges, and using the concept of sister cities and stuff like that to bridge those ties so that we can share experiences. We can share experiences on what it's like to build a cooperative or a community council, or this whole process of building the comunas. They're actually building cities right now. I mean, there are so many things happening in Venezuela, and it's hard to even talk about all of them. There's not enough time, but there are cities that are being built because one of the products of the increase in poverty and all the economic problems during the latter half of the 20th century, and the whole focus on oil was that all other industry was abandoned. Agricultural industry was abandoned, all other factories, whatever. So people had to come to the urban centers. Everyone came to Caracas, and they built these these shacks on the mountainside. So now the Chavez government, and then there's all this vast interior that's uninhabited. So what they're trying to do is build like satellite cities, creating a railroad system. We're building a railroad system also for the first time, and building satellite cities. So outside of the capital where people can then live in, and the cities are considered socialist cities, the ones that are being built. So in every city, there will be, the people that live there will work there as well, and will invest in, and be the ones running their city. I mean, that's something that's being built right now. It gives me chills thinking about it because it's so cool. And hopefully will work. But yeah, there are all these experiences that can be exchanged and shared. If ties can be built closer between the people of the U.S. and the people of Venezuela. And back there. And then I'll go to
Venezuelan too, I think there's a huge amount of inequalities, and there has been a huge amount of inequalities in the country. There's still some. I was in '89 when the Caracazo happened. You see that level of poverty. Also in '92 on the coup. I think one of the things that as I look at Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution, my question is, and I'm thinking that these are long-term processes. It's going to take years, it's going to take decades to take place to really grow within the population in the country. Will there be a revolution without Chavez? And if there is no, if the answer is no, isn't that the weakest point of Chavez?
Well, I mean, there is a revolution, so, period. And I think, he's been the unifying force, but he's not the reason. It's the people. And that while that fear sort of exists in a generalized way amongst many, that, what would happen without Chavez, that at the same time, eventually the changes would have happened in Venezuela anyway, and the country was at a boiling point. So, I mean, at this moment, we don't want to speculate on Chavez's absence because he's still president. But I believe that there's a new generation that's now grown up in a completely different circumstance in Venezuela. I mean, now it's been, 12 years, basically, of revolution. And while, yes, it still is a process, in the way that I envision it is, and that I believe others do as well, and Chavez often talks about 2021. Well, what is 2021? It's when we'll have two generations that will have grown up in the revolution, and the country is going to be entirely transformed. Because the biggest change that's already taken place has been the consciousness of the people. Now there are people growing up in an environment where they're actively participating, and they're encouraged to do so. That's a major change. where people, you know, are involved in everything. I mean, it's a huge difference, even though, despite all the problems. For me, I mean, well, this scenario is different because we're here debating and talking about this. But in general, when I come to the U.S., for example, leaving Venezuela, I come to the U.S. and people are, you know, the heads are somewhere else, you know, their brains. They're not thinking or working or being involved in the construction of the country and the communities and things. No, they're watching 1,000 channels on cable and or whatever the DVRs or whatever the technology is today, or playing some crazy video game or some kind of distraction, or drugged with consumerism, shopping, shopping, shopping. You know, and leaving Venezuela, that's the one thing that I always miss the most, is this sort of active debate and the level of everybody in general, opposition or not, you know, that's involved. And the youth of today that don't know how repressive it was before, those that oppose Chavez, for example, are involved. They're building student movements. Some of them are funded by the U.S., so I'm against that. But some of them aren't. And just the mere fact that they're there and they're debating, they want to be active and involved. That's a huge change. So, I mean, the revolution already exists. It's not going to go anywhere. You know, whether or not Chavez isn't going to live forever anyway. So he can be reelected, but who knows what will happen. And I just wanted to say, in terms of inequalities, during the last decade, poverty has been reduced by over 60%. That's a huge number. Huge number. I mean, the fact, and yes, there still is. Of course there still is. But illiteracy has been eradicated formally by policies, missions, programs, social programs of this government, of the Chavez government. And you know, we've seen huge advances in terms of all kinds of you know, social programs, healthcare. I mean, we don't even talk about any of that, but like a healthcare system. Imagine here you are in the U.S. with what, one of the worst healthcare systems in the world, in the sense of guaranteeing your right. Well, you don't have a right, so there you go. But you do in Venezuela. And, I mean, I personally go to the free clinics in Venezuela. And the attention is great, and you can get everything. You can get a what is it called? An MRI or CAT scan done for free. I mean, you go to the doctor and you say, my back hurts, I have this terrible back pain. They're not just going to say, you know, take a pill. And say, let's do an MRI, let's check everything, let's take blood, let's do it all. Because they're going to do a thorough checkup of you as a person to see what's wrong with you. And that's also, I mean, those types of things that we can look at now, and, you know, it's all passing, it's all happening, and okay, this healthcare system, those are going to have dramatic impacts on the people growing up today in Venezuela, who are living under that system. You know, we're now, that's what they're beginning to see as normality. Which when you step outside of that, and like I come here and I think, oh my God, I hope nothing happens to me because I don't have health insurance. You know, but when I'm in Venezuela, I don't even think about that. If anything happens, you know, I mean, I don't just go to the doctor for anything, but still, if anything happens, if you feel whatever, you can. You don't have to think about how much money do I have, what's going to happen to me. You know, do I have to think about my possibility of bankruptcy or any? I mean, I don't have to. You don't have to weigh your life against money. I mean, and those are things that are going to have huge changes. So, my personal opinion is that the revolution is already happening, regardless of Chavez.
Thank you for making us conscious, more conscious of our responsibility toward Venezuela, trying to hold back the claws of the U.S. And that, you know, through the more information that will help us to do that. I wanted to bring up a point that I don't think has been raised, and that is how much we in the U.S. have to thank Venezuela for. Venezuela today, as far as I can see, is a major contribution to, as a threat, it is a threat to the U.S. empire. The existence of Venezuela attempting to free itself from the empire and having done it to a great extent. The example of Alba uniting other countries in Latin America to again free themselves of the U.S. These contributions are immeasurable to the world, and I really think we have to see that it isn't just that Venezuela should be protected from the empire. That's of course, a major our task that we have to take up. But I think we should all be conscious that the existence of Venezuela and of the other countries that are trying to break free, and also of their speaking out against the crimes of the U.S. is of tremendous importance to the world today.
Absolutely, thank you for that. I have to say, as someone, I'm a citizen of both countries, but of course I was born in the U.S. But I mean, I can't appreciate enough the dignity and of the voice of Hugo Chavez in the face of U.S. crimes around the world. And he's one of the only leaders, heads of states on our planet today, who's willing to do that, who's willing to, and actually, you know, Venezuela, if you look closely at Venezuela's foreign policy is always consistent under Chavez. Consistent in the sense of, even with the most recent, the killing of Osama bin Laden, you know, Venezuela again, of course, isn't going to come out and say we love Osama bin Laden, and expressed its sympathies, deepest sympathies, to the victims of the attacks of September 11th, but condemned the use of assassination as a political tool and called on the U.S. to withdraw all of its forces from those countries that it's continuing to occupy. You know, and the same in the case of Libya, when everyone around the world, all the allies of Gaddafi are coming out saying, you know, let's invade and bomb and kill him, initiating the campaign. Chavez was pretty much the only voice, taking all the risks of being demonized by everyone who's saying, oh, you're supporting Gaddafi then. You're supporting Gaddafi who's killing his people. He said, wait a minute, whoa, we're not going to support a military attack against a country. Any country, it doesn't matter. You know, it's the policy. That's our policy. Those are our principles, as they're the same principles that we apply on a national level, which goes for social justice, which is why, for example, Venezuela's oil company, PDVSA, which has its subsidiary up here, owns Citgo, which you have Citgo in Chicago, continues the same policies that it does in Venezuela in terms of using its oil profits to invest in the well-being of the people. And in the U.S., some of you guys have probably heard of the program that Citgo funds, which is to provide low-cost heating oil to poorer communities. You know, and I think it's in like 15 states. And imagine that every year, the organization that has helped facilitate this, which is Citizens Energy, that Joe Kennedy runs, has asked, every year they've asked every oil company, and first the U.S. ones, to help, you know, subsidize heating oil and costs, and the only company that's responded, and it's been this way since 2006, has been Citgo. Yeah, I mean, those are things that are just extraordinary sometimes to remember. And wait a minute, that makes no sense. Like, what about Chevron, Exxon, and all these other companies? They're not doing it, Citgo's the one doing it. It's the solid principles of solidarity and of social justice, and of anti-interventionism and anti-imperialism. And yeah, I mean, it's something that regionally is incredibly important. I mean, and I'm completely 100% humbled and privileged and appreciative of the fortune that I've had to be able to accompany Chavez, for example, on trips around the world. And I've seen in every country, I mean, places you would, including U.S., you know, the amounts of people who just come out to express like that love, and that's what it is in the end, love for somebody who has been willing to risk everything to take on a position of dignity and to represent, you know, millions of people's voices around the world. So many things that so many would love to say or do that he does. And I mean, he's someone in the end, and I don't mean to just, you know, turn this into some kind of love fest of Hugo Chavez, but who has given his life over to that. Because at every risk, you can imagine, I mean, the biggest risk of all, which is his own life, has been taken and is continuing to be taken. And he said that. I mean, after the defeat of the coup in 2002, and he was rescued by the people of Venezuela. And he's made it very clear, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the people of Venezuela. My life is for them. I owe it to them. So everything he does, I mean, that's why sometimes it's so unbelievably frustrating
and just, I mean, difficult to, you know, bear witness to, and being an analyst of media about Venezuela, the campaign of demonization. I mean, and just it's so severe to see that and know the reality, you know, and right, to hear people just say, like, oh, the dictator, this, yeah, it's a death wish, as the guy said, or you know, it's basically an authorization to kill. And that this is someone who's, you know, risked everything to bring and to create and build a better world, to say it in a kind of cheesy, corny way. But it's true, you know. And who will continue till his last breath, and that I'm 100% positive, to fight for social justice. And I mean, I think most of us, or a lot of us in this room, are fighters for social justice and believe in social justice.